am Paul Melmeyer. I am the Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy here at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And I should also start by saying Happy National Disability Independence Day, the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act being signed into law. Of course, on such a day, there perhaps was no better topic to spend our time on this afternoon than disability employment. And specifically today, we're going to be focusing on legislative efforts on disability employment, talking about two pieces of legislation on Capitol Hill right now that we're going to introduce you to, and then hope that you'll join us in advocating for. But before I get there, I want to first introduce our illustrative panel, everyone who's going to be talking about these bills. First of all, we have Christian Klesse, who is the Disability Policy Fellow at the Senate Special Committee on Aging, led by Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. We're actually very pleased to include one additional expert from the Senate Special Committee on Aging. That's Michael Gamel, McCormick. He is a Disability Policy Director. Now, of course, Michael is assisting in all things legislation today, so we hope to have as much time as he can offer. But Michael, again, thank you for joining for the day. But aside from those who are joining us from the Senate Special Committee on Aging, we also have two policy experts from the National Disability Rights Network, those being Cyrus Ancharek and Cheryl Bates Harris, who are also going to talk about these two pieces of legislation and provide a bit of a background on disability employment as well. So let me tell you again what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to start with why is employment legislation even needed at this point? What is the background? What is the history of why and how we find ourselves in the situation we're in today? And then we're going to talk about two bills that would improve opportunities for those with disabilities to find well-paying jobs. The first being a Disability Employment Incentive Act, S630, and then the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act, HR 2373. And then we'll, of course, close with how you can make your voice heard in supporting these two pieces of legislation. So we're going to start on our next slide with just a bit of a background on where we find ourselves today, a history on legislative efforts legislative efforts on disability employment and the history on how we find ourselves today. So with that, I'm going to introduce Cheryl Bates Harris. Cheryl, you are our foremost expert here on this. Please take it away.
Oh, thank you very much. Next slide, please. Okay, so first I just want to tell you briefly who the National Disability Rights Network is. We are the membership organization for 9 federally mandated programs that make up the Protection and Advocacy System and the Client Assistance Program. All 57 states and territories have what we call a Protection and Advocacy Agency and the Client Assistance Program. So that these, basically our goal and our purpose is to prevent people with disabilities, to make sure that they are free from abuse, neglect, and discrimination based on disability. So we work in all areas of disability, guarding against abuse, advocating for basic civil rights. We view disability rights as civil rights, ensuring access and accountability in all kinds of systems, employment, education, housing, transportation, as well as the juvenile justice and criminal justice system. So we work on disability issues constantly, and my specialty is actually employment of people with disabilities. So next slide, please. I've actually been working to increase employment of people with disabilities for much longer than I would like to admit. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of background history to how we got to where we are today. And, you know, for hundreds of years, people with disabilities have existed, and there was never much of an expectation that they would do anything in terms of employment. If we were lucky, they got good custodial care, but there was certainly never an expectation of employment. And looking back at the history of disability employment, people with disabilities, it was not until large institutions were formed that there was really an expectation that people with disabilities would do anything. And these large institutions basically operated on peonage. Individuals who were residing within the facility, to the extent that they were able to do something, were put to work to keep the institution operational. So they would grow their own fruits and vegetables, for instance, and people would work on that. There was food service that needed to be done, so those that could would work in the kitchens, landscaping, cleaning the building, all kinds of things. So the early history of people with disabilities was really, like I said, in institutional settings, doing work that kept the institution operational. And then around the 1960s, there was the big deinstitutionalization movement, which moved people from large facilities into community situations, either group homes or ICFMRs or other, smaller living arrangements. And then again, the expectation initially was that we were just going to move people out and change their living situation. And in many situations, what that meant was that younger individuals who were born with disabilities were no longer placed into large institutions. So mom and dad had the responsibility, or grandma had the responsibility of taking care of the individual with the disability during the day. So sheltered workshops or congregate facilities really started with the idea that mom and dad still had to go to work. And so where was Johnny going to go during the day so that the parents could continue to work? So these sheltered workshops often started in church basements or somebody's garage, with the idea that then different people with disabilities could interact and at least be with other people that were their similar peers. And then as these children got older, parents started to think, well, maybe we can find them some kind of work, or maybe we can start to teach them some job skills, with the idea that eventually we may be able to think about real employment for them. So sheltered workshops really flourished in the early part of the 70s. And businesses figured out that this was a really good way that they could get a lot of their menial work done by sending it to a sheltered workshop, contracting the work to the sheltered workshop, and keep people supposedly busy and teach them job skills to prepare for employment. The only problem is that sheltered workshops typically lead nowhere. So people in sheltered workshops pretty much live or die in sheltered workshops or retire. Very few people moved into competitive employment. So around 1986, the Rehabilitation Services introduced supported employment and supported employment for people with the most significant disabilities, in order to really move people from sheltered workshops, or even stop them from going to sheltered workshops and move them directly into employment, using what we call a place and train model. You place the individual in the job first, you train them how to do the job, and then they are competitively employed, so to speak. And it was not until 2014, with the passage of the Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act, that competitive integrated employment was clearly defined. Because even with supported employment in the 80s, individuals could still be paid a sub-minimum wage in an integrated employment setting. So I'm going to talk next about sub-minimum wage. So next slide, please. So there's basically 4 pieces of legislation that are really important to employment of people with disabilities. And the first is, of course, the Fair Labor Standard Act, which was passed in 1938. Now, if you think about 1938, that we were in a post-World War I era and largely a manufacturing economy. So the Fair Labor Standard Act established things that we all know about: the standard work week, overtime pay, outlawed child labor. And there was this really sexy or unsexy provision called Section 14C, which allowed employers at the time to pay individuals who were disabled for the work that was being done less than the minimum wage in order to give them the dignity of continuing employment. And I want to really drive that point home because it was passed in 1938 specifically to honor wounded veterans coming back from World War I and enable them to continue to work and allow employers to pay them less than the minimum wage just for the dignity of being able to continue to work. So then we fast forward a number of years and we come to 1973. And it was in 1973 when the Rehabilitation Act, as we know it today, was passed. And so for the first time in 1973, all people with disabilities were allowed to apply for and receive vocational rehabilitation services that would help them prepare for, obtain, or regain employment that was consistent with their interests, strengths, and abilities. Now, what was really important with the Rehabilitation Act, as much as the fact that it opened services to all kinds of disabilities and really became a cross-disability program, because prior to that, again, most of the people who got rehab services were people who had suffered physical injuries, such as wounded veterans. But the Rehabilitation Act also established the groundwork for some basic civil rights protections and non-discrimination, and all those Title V of the Rehab Act. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to skip on to in 1975, children, the Education of Handicapped Children's Act was introduced, and that later morphed into what we call the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it really placed an emphasis on the fact that everyone is entitled to a free and appropriate public education, and that the purpose of educating children is to move them into either post-secondary issues or into employment and adulthood. So IDEA in 1990 added some very specific requirements around transition to assure that people could move smoothly from education to to either higher education or to employment in the world of work. And of course, we all know about the ADA, the landmark legislation that was really the promise of non-discrimination in all areas, not just employment, but in all areas of life, so that people with disabilities were no longer viewed as second-class citizens. And then the ADA amendments of 2008, of course, clarified who was a person with a disability. So next slide, please. Okay, so how does this really all tie together? My professional career has been on encouraging and promoting the full employment of people with disabilities. And when you look at some basic language that is found in the Rehabilitation Act, it clearly states that the purpose is to move to maximize employment and economic self-sufficiency. Well, the only way I know to maximize anyone's employment or economic self-sufficiency is through employment. And I will also say that employment is the only route out of poverty. When you look at IDEA, it also talks about adult services, independent living, and community participation in an integrated employment. So again, the thinking and the focus was these are basic responsibilities, or these are basic rights of people. So again, it ties into integrated employment. And this kind of shows a shift in the thinking. And of course, with the ADA, it was to assure equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and again, economic self-sufficiency. Next slide, and I think that's, yes. So that's kind of the background. I just want to re-emphasize that the sub-minimum wage was, again, a 1938 provision that is just long outdated. Turn it back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl. And we'll go back to the sub-minimum wage just a little bit later as we're talking about the second bill on the agenda today. But first, we wanted to talk about the Disability Employment Incentive Act. And Christian, Thank you again for joining us today. And Michael, again, I invite you to add anything to a conversation we'll have with Christian as we go along. But Christian, we did want to talk about the Disability Employment Incentive Act. As we understand, this is one of the foremost efforts on Capitol Hill to actually increase employment for those with disabilities. And really, I'm just going to start very simply. And again, thank you to you, but also thank you to your boss, Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, for leading on this issue. I'm just going to start simply with tell us about the Disability Employment Incentive Act and how it would help people living with a disability earn and retain employment.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thanks for having us here today to talk about Senator Casey's work. It is an area that he's very passionate about, so we're happy to kind of share more information and let you guys know where we are. But the Disability Employment Incentive Act, S630, was introduced in March of this year. And what it does is it amends 3 existing tax credits that are available to businesses that hire and retain employees with disabilities. And those 3 tax credits are the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, the Disability Access Expenditures Tax Credit, and then the Architectural and Transportation Barrier Tax Credit. It's a pretty big adjustment to each of those. It basically doubles the existing credit that's available for all 3 of those. And so for people who aren't as familiar, the Work Opportunity Tax Credit is available to employers that hire a person with a disability that's referred to them through Voc Rehab. And what it does is the amendment made through this legislation increases the amount of a person's salary that's available to be claimed through that tax credit. And so it increases the total credit from $2,400 to $5,000, and then adds a second-year credit for businesses that retain that employee of $2,500. So that's a possible $5,000 increase there. And then our Disability Access Expenditures Tax Credit is available to businesses with gross receipts that are less than $3 million a year or that have fewer than 60 full-time employees. And that credit is raised from $5,000 to $10,000. And then finally, we have the Architectural and Transportation Barrier Tax Credit. And that's available for businesses that make accessibility improvements to existing structural features or transportation features. And then through the DEIA, what it also does is it makes that credit available for businesses that update their digital or online workspaces as well. And that credit increases from $15,000 to $30,000. That's a really big increase there.
Great, thank you, Christian. Thank you for that overview. Actually, let me pause just for a moment before I get to my second question. I neglected to mention earlier, we're throwing a whole lot of information at everybody here on the webinar. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box down below on your webinar screen. We're gonna have a time for questions at the end of our webinar on both bills, as well as the background, everything we're talking about. Please do enter your questions there. We hope to be able to get to all of your questions at the end of our conversation. So Christian, back to you. A second question about the legislation. With these increased incentives for hiring those with disabilities, how do we ensure businesses actually know about their availability? We've heard stories in which businesses just simply don't know about existing incentives, those in the books right now, to actually hire those with disabilities, let alone potential new incentives that could be enacted as part of this legislation. So how do we make sure that if we were to be successful in actually enacting this legislation, we work with the business community to ensure that they know all of the incentives that exist for hiring?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's a problem that we see with a lot of legislation is there's this really good bill out there that can help a lot of people, but then people don't know about it. They don't know how to implement it. And so I think, that's a problem that we're not going to solve from just one angle. It's something we're going to have to kind of approach from a kind of multifaceted approach. And so we're going to need, businesses to kind of take the initiative and learn what's out there for themselves. It's going to take financial advisors and tax people and accountants to kind of be taught and learn about what's available to them. It's also going to take disability advocates and disability organizations to go out to businesses and say, hey, these credits are available to you. You already employ people with disabilities, or there's people with disabilities who want to work for you. These are huge bonuses if you hire them. And then also, we'll just need a public education campaign to kind of get that word out there. One thing that the disability community does really, really well is grassroots organizing and getting information out there and letting people know, what they bring to the table, what's available to them, and kind of how to access that. So I think, everybody coming together and working to make sure businesses know about it is kind of going to be our best approach.
Yeah, absolutely, Christian. That's a fantastic answer. We couldn't agree more. Let's talk about the business community though, and their response to the legislation. Are they supportive? Do they believe that the incentives within the legislation actually would make a meaningful difference in hiring new employees with disabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. The businesses that we interacted with kind of in crafting the legislation in previous Congresses and this Congress as well have all been supportive. They think it's a great concept. DEIA to them is an important piece of legislation that they want to move forward. But, as you mentioned, there's still a huge chunk of businesses out there that don't know about these tax credits, don't know about this bill that's out there that can help them. And so, we've seen that disability employment has traditionally lagged behind employment for people without disabilities. And this is just one of those steps that we can take to help bump up those disability employment numbers and get people working.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. So what is it about the current incentives that are inadequate, that are not encouraging businesses well enough at the very least to hire those with disabilities? Is it that the existing credits just simply aren't lucrative enough? The credits aren't enough of a financial incentive to actually draw businesses in to be hiring those with disabilities? Is it something about the current structure of our existing credits that just don't really work well enough, I suppose, for businesses looking to hire those with disabilities? What is it about our existing credits that is inadequate?
Yeah, and I think we've heard less about kind of what's inadequate about the existing credits that are available. I think what's really leading the kind of decrease in numbers there is just the lack of awareness. It's possible that businesses haven't prioritized making accessibility improvements at that current credit, thinking, that's not enough of a credit to kind of encourage me to spend that money. But what we're hopeful of is by doubling all three of these credits, we really can kind of get some momentum moving, get some businesses talking, get people engaged in kind of hiring people with disabilities, making sure that their workspaces are accessible, and really kind of get, some conversations happening to better engage in that competitive integrated employment.
Great, absolutely, absolutely. So an additional question for any of those in the webinar here who follow what's happening in Washington, D.C., what the most topical policy questions and discussions are on. Infrastructure is in many ways the talk of the town right now. And there's a lot that is infrastructure related, I would say, within this legislation, as of course, as part of the infrastructure efforts, hiring is going to be a big part of that. So tell me, is there a possibility that this legislation could actually be included in that efforts, or it could be discussed in that effort? What is there any intersection between the Disability Employment Incentive Act and efforts ongoing with infrastructure?
Yeah, and so I think, what is included and not included in that infrastructure package is changing and still a developing idea. But, outside of that big infrastructure package that's in the news, there's additional packages that are being considered by individual committees. And so we're always kind of watching what committees are talking about, asking questions, looking for opportunities to include any of Senator Casey's bills. But, Michael and I specifically working on this bill, always kind of have our ears to the ground, seeing, where's an opportunity to move something or plug our policies into that discussion. I think it's much more likely that this bill could be included in an end of the year tax package, or just with a new piece of tax legislation that comes up. We expect there to be at least one opportunity for that before the end of the calendar year. And what we can do is keep you guys up to date as we hear more about that. Possible opportunities for weighing in, with your member offices. But in the meantime, it never hurts to bring up the bill with any offices that you and your members are talking to. Ask your boss to become a co-sponsor to support the legislation and get involved and advocate that way.
Yeah, Christian, you moved right along to my final question for you on the legislation, which is what can the neuromuscular disease community do to contribute to getting this bill actually enacted into law. And on that topic, what kind of stories are most impactful to senators also as representatives, but folks like your boss, if they're considering co-sponsoring, what is a very impactful story that could be shared that a senator or representative would hear that story and then be motivated to sign on to the legislation?
Yeah, so obviously we'd always encourage anyone to reach out to their senator for legislation that they want them to support. That really can make the difference for some members. Hearing that personal story, getting to meet someone, knowing how something affects their life is kind of can be that big push that gets them over the edge. A story about how, especially in this space, stories of people with disabilities that find employment, that find especially that competitive integrated employment, and how that's helped them succeed, whether that be, paying for school, helping them get an education, pay for transportation costs, medical care, housing, saving for the future, things like that, where there's these this bill helped me get this job, and by doing that, I was able to save, or I was able to pay for this, or I was able to improve my life this way. Those stories are really impactful. And I know for Senator Casey, a story is always going to go further than anything that Michael and I can tell him, because there's that one-on-one interaction with his constituents. And so, just telling stories about your experiences to your senator is kind of going to be your best way to advocate for getting them involved in these bills.
Fantastic. Absolutely, Christian. And we're going to get back at the end of today's conversation to exactly how everyone on today's webinar can tell their story through ways with MDA, but not through other mechanisms. But Christian, thank you again for this absolutely perfect overview of the legislation. We may have some questions at the end if you're willing to stick around. But for now, we do want to transition over to the second piece of legislation that we have on the agenda today, and that's the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act. And first, I believe I'm going to actually invite Cyrus to give us an overview of the legislation and how it would benefit those with disabilities. Cyrus, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. I do feel kind of odd talking about this bill since we have two folks from Senator Casey's office who's the lead on this over in the Senate. So please chime in if I get anything wrong here. Yeah, my name is Cyrus Sincherik. I'm from NDRN. I work primarily in education, but I also cover employment. And based on Cheryl's presentation, you can sort of see that there is sort of a thread that runs between education and employment for not just for people with disabilities, but for all people. But before I get into TCIA, which is the acronym I'm using for the transformation bill, I want to just set a little bit of context regarding sort of the policy sphere that we're operating in right now. And I just want to drill down briefly on three of the laws that deal with employment of people with disabilities that my colleague Cheryl had gone through earlier in the presentation. And I want to sort of illustrate some of the inconsistencies that we're seeing that exist in the existing statutes and how that necessitates TCIA. So like Cheryl said, the ADA is quite clear on where it stands on unemployment of people with disabilities. So as you see here on the slide, this is directly from the ADA, and I'll just read it for the benefit of everybody. It says that the Congress finds that the nation's proper goals regarding individuals with disabilities are to ensure equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for such individuals. And so the important provision here is the economic self-sufficiency. So it's clear that the ADA essentially mandates that we work towards economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. Moving on to the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, or WIOA, as I refer to it. This was a workforce statute, and again, this is the bill that prioritizes competitive integrated employment and actually defines it. And this is a concept where people with disabilities work in mainstream jobs alongside and are paid comparable wages to coworkers without disabilities. So this would be the ideal employment outcome from our perspective for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. And then the third law I want to talk about is the Fair Labor Standards Act. Again, this was a statute that was passed many, many years ago, in the post-World War I era. And as Cheryl said, this is the law that includes Section 14C, which is the provision that today still permits employers to pay some people with disabilities even less than the minimum wage. And I would just underscore that, we believe that this is an antiquated provision that is no longer necessary in the context in which we live. So the reason I want to drill down on these three laws is I think it's pretty clear that there are inconsistencies that exist in existing law. The biggest inconsistency being between the Fair Labor Standards Act and the ADA and WIOA. As I said, ADA and WIOA really make clear that we should be pursuing economic self-sufficiency for people with disabilities. We should, ideal outcomes for employment outcomes for people with disabilities should be in a competitive, integrated employment environment. Unfortunately, those realizations cannot come to fruition with the continued existence of Section 14C. We cannot say that, we are going to improve employment outcomes for all people with disabilities and then allow a section of that population to continue to be paid some minimum wages under 14C certificates. We will just never be able to realize, again, ADA or 14C fully. So like I said, I just wanted to bring that up because it's a pretty stark inconsistency from a policy perspective. So let me just talk a little bit about NDRN's policy position currently on 14C and some minimum wages. So I think you can probably tell that we are very much in favor of the elimination of the 14C provision, which is why we are pushing for TCIEA and are very supportive of that piece of legislation. Very thankful to Representative Scott in the House and Senator Casey in the Senate for leading on this bill. That's sort of position one. And then sort of on a broader level, we believe that, maintaining Section 14C, does nothing more than it just endorses the perpetuation of a life of poverty and dependency for people with disabilities who are paid some minimum wages. And so like my colleague Cheryl said, probably the only way to get out of poverty is through employment. But again, that will never be realized if people are being paid, pennies on the dollar for their work. So with that, let me sort of talk high level about TCIEA. Next slide, please. And Christian, Michael, this is where I certainly welcome any clarification or corrections here. So TCIEA, or the Transformation and Competitive Integrated Employment Act, HR 2373, was introduced a few months back in the House by Representative Bobby Scott, who is the chair of the Education and Labor Committee, and Representative Kathy McMorris-Rogers, who is the ranking member on Energy and Commerce. It is bipartisan. Representative Scott is a Democrat, and Representative Kathy McMorris-Rogers is a Republican. As of today, there are 20 co-sponsors, 17 Democrats, and 3 Republicans, which is fantastic. So really the backdrop for TCIEA, as we see it at NDRN, is that not all employers and states have the resources to transition to CIE, or competitive integrated employment. I'm sure you folks have seen in the news, many states have taken it upon themselves to phase out the use of 14C certificates, which is great. But again, not every state is going to be able to do it on their own without additional federal assistance, quite frankly. And sort of another part of the backdrop here is, we don't want to be in a situation, we don't want a sort of immediate phase out of 14C, which might seem kind of counterintuitive based on the discussions we've been having today. But if I could just enumerate our position here, the reason is, we don't want people who are working in a 14C environment to all of a sudden be out of a job. So, tomorrow we phase out 14C, and then what's going to happen to Johnny as as Cheryl said, I mean, where is this individual going to go, right? They've been working and now they're all of a sudden out of a job. So the beauty of TCIA is that it's a very gradual approach, which is our preferred approach. So let me just go over sort of 5 key provisions of the bill, which I've laid out here on the slide. But sort of the first provision is that the bill would create a competitive state grant program to assist states to transition all 14C certificate holders to models that support competitive integrated employment for individuals with disabilities. The second provision, this is largely for states that don't apply for the competitive state grant, but have employers or service providers in states that do want to transition to CIE. So this would create a competitive grant program for current 14C certificate holders to transition their business models to support individuals with disabilities in a CIE setting. The third provision is that it immediately freezes the issuance of any new 14C certificates from the Department of Labor, which oversees this program, and phases out the use of existing 14C certificates over 5 years until employees are paid at least the federal minimum wage. So I just want to stop at this point, very briefly. Again, this is sort of the gradual phase out that we sort of like. We love the idea that, okay, we're going to phase this out, so DOL should not be issuing any new certificates to new employers who want to obtain a certificate. And then at the same time, let's phase this out over sort of a gradual period to ensure that workers who are working in non-CIA environments are not all of a sudden out of a job, but have the opportunity to transition into a CIE employment without there being a gap in their employment history. Next slide, please. The bill also establishes a technical assistance center to assist states and individual 14C certificate holders on transitioning to CIE settings. And then there's also a reporting and evaluation provision to ensure that that progress is being made. So sort of in summary, we just really believe that this bill provides stakeholders and states with the resources to help transition workers with disabilities from sub-minimum wage, pardon, that's a typo on my end, should be sub-minimum wage settings to competitive integrated employment. And then I also just want to say that the protection advocacy agencies, which are the member agencies that Cheryl and I represent, are also taken into account in this bill, which is great in 2 places. One, the PNAs are eligible to be on the state advisory council. So states that take the money, take the competitive grants, have to establish a state advisory council, of which the PNAs are also members. And then in the provision for individual employers that want to apply for grants to transition transition from 14C to CIE, they are required to partner with other organizations that have experience providing support to individual with disabilities in a CIE setting, and the PNAs can be an eligible partner there. So we're very thankful to Mr. Scott and Mr. Casey for including our member agencies, which do have extensive experience in not only CIE, but also disability employment policy writ large. I guess I should stop there. I don't want to pull lateral here, Paul, but if Christian or Michael have anything to add, since this is really their bill in the Senate.
I think Michael had to jump off for another call, and I am not as well versed in this, so I think everything you said is up to date with what I know, and I'll kind of not step in otherwise.
Great, thank you. Back to you, Paul. All right, well thank you so much, Cyrus, on an excellent overview of the legislation. Christian, also thank you for the few words there, and as Cyrus said, and as you noticed there There, of course, is an introduced House version of this legislation. In previous Congresses, Senator Casey has introduced the Senate version, and we're of course expecting him to be leading on this again in a not so distant future. So let's tell you all just a few moments on, now that we've convinced you on the importance of these two pieces of legislation, the first, of course, being let's incentivize businesses to hire those with disabilities. The second being let's actually make sure when hired that they are paid a competitive wage. Let's tell you how you can support the legislation. Of course, the ways in which you can tell your story of either successfully finding employment and how important that has been for either you or your loved one, or the ways in which finding employment has been incredibly difficult for you or your loved one. Those are the impactful stories that really can change the hearts and minds of senators and representatives who may not already be supporting the legislation. But that can take a lot of work, that can take a lot of effort. So let me tell you a very simple way of supporting the legislation we just overviewed. And that's to go to mda.org/advocacy, where you'll find this action opportunity here, which allows you to email your congresspersons, both representatives and senators, in support of the legislation, asking them to co-sponsor the legislation. The more co-sponsors we have, the more evidence that it is supported widely across Capitol Hill, the greater attention it will get from the committees of jurisdiction and of course from leadership, the more likely that it could, in the first example of the legislation on incentives, that it could be added to a tax bill later on in the year, or also for the second bill, that it could be added to additional legislation or passed on its own. So please do go to mda.org/advocacy or text MDA USA to 504-507 to join us and make your voice heard on these two very important pieces of legislation. So we have just about 15 minutes left in the hour and would love to hear your questions. And I'll tell you, we already had 2 questions submitted. And Keith, thank you so much for submitting these questions. I'm going to start with your first. And this has to do with legislation on tax credits. So Christian, I would turn to you first on this, but then of course invite Cyrus and Cheryl to contribute from there. But let me read Keith's question. It would be great to have a one-pager with these tax credits to be included with resumes when applying for jobs. Many employers are probably unaware of the credits, as we discussed. Is this something that is available? Now, I don't know if necessarily that would actually be included in the legislation itself, but Christian, is that something that you think could be impactful in ensuring that businesses are aware of existing credits and then would be aware of the credits included in this legislation?
Yeah, that's actually a good idea for making sure that businesses know what's happening and what's available to them. I'm not aware. I could believe that like different disability employment organizations would kind of have their own one-pagers made up. I'm not aware of like a common source one-pager that does exist, but that's something interesting to consider.
Apologies, I'm on mute. I muted myself. Cheryl, please continue from there. I saw you unmute yourself if you have any thoughts on this idea.
I do have thoughts, but I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. I absolutely agree that a lot of these tax credits and tax incentives are unknown. But I also know that discrimination is our business and business is good. And as an applicant or as an applicant with a disability, I think that if you automatically send with your resume, first of all, identify yourself as a person with a disability, you could inadvertently be setting yourself up for blatant discrimination. And even if you didn't identify yourself as a person with a disability, if an employer that's not familiar with disability sees this information about a tax credit, you have in fact disclosed that you have a disability, and then it's going to make it much harder for the employer to evaluate you basically on your merits, especially if they bought into a lot of employers, let me step sideways a minute. A lot of employers are not opposed to hiring a person with a disability, but they think if they hire a person with a disability, because it's a protected class, they would have to keep them forever on their payroll. And they're a little bit afraid of that and afraid that their insurance costs are going to go up. I mean, all of this is false information. So I would never encourage anyone who's applying for a job to apply and disclose disability before you've actually had an interview. That's just kind of a cautionary tale. So.
Cheryl, that's incredibly important context to add, and it has, I'm sure it's informed by, if not your own, many lived experiences of those who you work very closely with, and consequently, it's a very, very, very important point. Very unfortunately as well, to add one more to add to the conversation on considering, mentioning tax credits as part of applying for a job. So thank you, Cheryl, for that perspective, certainly. Cheryl, I'm going to actually go back to you on this next question that we have from Keith, and this has to do with eligibility requirements for SSI, Supplemental Security Income, and Medicaid, and whether people should be justifiably or unjustifiably concerned that higher wages could actually lead to jeopardizing access to very important programs for those with disabilities.
Okay, this is one of my favorite questions, because this is actually, there is a great deal of myth around the fact that if you go back to work and you start earning wages, that your SSI and your Medicaid are going to be affected. And the answer is yes, they are going to be affected, but not necessarily in a bad way. SSI is a program that is based on, it's a needs-based program. So the bad news about SSI is that you cannot accumulate assets if you're an individual of over $2,000 and still retain your eligibility. However, the good side on the work incentives is that basically for every $2 that you earn, your SSI benefit check will be reduced by $1. But I can show you that if you are working and earning money, that you are always going to have more cash at the end of the month and more disposable income by working than not working. And even if you reach the point where your cash benefit is now zero, so the federal benefit rate is $794. So roughly if you double that, let's say $1,600 a month. If you're earning $1,600 a month roughly, then your SSI benefit check will be reduced to zero. But which is better, $1,600 a month or $794 a month? So again, the cash part is better. Now on the Medicaid side of things, as long as the only thing that keeps you from an SSI check is earnings, okay, then you retain your Medicaid eligibility as long as you continue to need and use your Medicaid. So if you have to go to the doctor once a year, you've used your Medicaid, you can retain it up to a state's threshold. And this gets a little bit more complicated, but a state threshold could be somewhere between $36,000 and $50,000 a year. And so if your earnings are below the threshold, there's no problem. And if your Medicaid usage is higher than the average individual in your state, you can obtain a much higher individual threshold. So it's possible that you could forever retain your Medicaid eligibility. So people really do need to understand how the work incentives work, because there's no reason a person on SSI can't work, have more income, improve their quality of life, and still maintain access to the Medicaid that's so important.
Hey, Paul, this is Cyrus. Could I also jump in on this, if that's okay?
Please do.
Perfect. Yeah, this is also a topic that I'm really interested in as well, and do a lot of work in. To answer Keith's question about any efforts alongside the two bills we talked about today, I just wanted to take a moment to share that there is a bill out there introduced by Senator Brown, and actually Senator Casey is a co-sponsor of the bill, and this is the SSI Restoration Act. And I don't cover Social Security, but in a nutshell, the bill would raise SSI monthly benefits, and would also update and index the asset limits far above $2,000. So that's another bill that I know NDRN has endorsed that bill, and that is a bill that we are pushing. Another bill I would like to just talk about as well, because Christian's on from Senator Casey's office, is the Able Age Adjustment Act. I think you're sort of seeing a theme here, is that Bob Casey is a major champion for a lot of a lot of the priorities for our communities, which is great. But the Able Age Adjustment Act would raise the age eligibility threshold for ABLE accounts, which I'm not sure how familiar people are with those accounts, but these are tax advantage savings vehicles for people with disabilities where they can contribute money, $15,000 annually, to pay for qualified disability expenses, and that's very broad. That could be transportation, education, a whole bunch of other items. And about 44 states have an ABLE program. The problem with ABLE is that, as currently written, you have to have your disability has to onset prior to age 26. So if you develop a disability at 28, well, you're ineligible. But so that's one bill we're trying to push to get the age eligibility raised to 46. But the great thing about an ABLE account is that money does not count towards means tested programs such as SSI, and then your Medicaid does not. Nothing happens with Medicaid until you have about $100,000 in an ABLE account. So to Cheryl's point, I mean, obviously, if you're making sort of extra income or something like that, and you're worried as you're transitioning to full employment and trying to get off SSI, if you have extra income, you can always stick that in an ABLE account, open an ABLE account, stick it in there, and then that money does not contribute, is not accounted when calculating eligibility for means tested programs. I hope that made sense. I don't know, Cheryl, if I missed anything there.
Yeah, it does make sense. It also allows, whereas people may not be able to put money into an employer retirement plan, they could put the money into an ABLE account and it doesn't affect their eligibility for the benefits. So there's always advantages to work.
Yeah, absolutely, Cyrus and Cheryl. Thank you for that. And while we of course didn't go into depth and into the two bills that you just referenced today, there's not enough time in an hour. Of course, perhaps we can schedule another Advocacy Institute and invite you both back to talk about the SSI Restoration Act as well as the ABLE Act, the update to the ABLE Act as well. For those who are interested in finding more information, Cheryl and Cyrus, is there information on the NDRN website for which individuals could go seek?
I don't, well, no, there's no action alert.
I'm sorry.
No, can I send you all, or I can, I want to do this. Why don't I put some information in the chat and then you all can circulate?
That sounds just fine. That sounds just fine. We'll be sure that it's included in any materials we send out following the webinar. Thank you for that, Cyrus and Cheryl. So just one more question, and this is again on the sub-minimum wage. And Cheryl and Cyrus, please feel free to jump in, either of you, to answer this. But Cyrus, you mentioned that there are certain states that are moving away from the sub-minimum wage. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about that, telling us, do any states actually outlaw the use of the sub-minimum wage at this point? Or are there state efforts to move away from that? Or are other states particularly behind, I suppose? Feel free to take your answer in any direction, but just tell us a little bit about the state situation and if states actually have successfully moved away from the sub-minimum wage.
Thanks for the question, Paul. I'm going to answer just very briefly, and then I'm actually going to turn it over to Cheryl. I hate to deflect, but I'm going to give it to Cheryl because she's much more attuned to what's going on at the state level. But yes, I mean, to answer your question in short, there are states that have successfully moved away from widespread use of 14C certificates and are now pursuing competitive integrated employment or supported employment. I think we're up to 9-12 states perhaps at this point that have laws in the books that have outlawed 14C. But let me, Cheryl, my colleague, is much more attuned to this. So I'll pass over to her.
Thank you, Cyrus. Yes, there are a number of states that have passed legislation which basically either has eliminated or will be phasing out 14C. The most recent two states that did that was the state of Delaware and state of Hawaii. Within the last 2 weeks, they signed legislation. Maryland passed legislation about 4 years ago, and I believe this is the year that the sub-minimum wage is supposed to be phased out. And, you know, New Hampshire, Maryland, Oregon, Washington State, Nevada, and Hawaii are other states off the top of my head that will no longer permit sub-minimum wage after a certain date. All the legislation is slightly different in terms of when their phase out is, but they're certainly moving in the direction of ending sub-minimum wage. And so I think if you end sub-minimum wage, there will actually be an increase in employment of people with disabilities, because then the sheltered workshops that are currently holding on to people and paying them sub-minimum wage will no longer be able to do that. So it will not be beneficial for them to continue to employ those people, because it's going to cost them more money, and their profit margin from doing the contract work that is sent to sheltered workshops is going to be significantly reduced. So if they're paying people closer to real wages, why not just help them get real jobs in the community? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, Cheryl. Thank you for that answer, and it really does paint the picture on how impactful moving away from sub-minimum wage or 14C as is the code citation, I suppose, is how impactful it really can be to be moving towards competitive employment for those with disabilities. You know, we only have about 2 minutes left in the hour. I'm just gonna reference one more point that was in the chat, which is how important it will be to have resources available to the community on these nuances of how these programs interact with wages and with income, particularly Medicaid. Couldn't agree more, Keith. Perhaps that's a second advocacy institute that we can conduct on Medicaid and its eligibility requirements for Medicaid and its intersection with employment. But at least for today, I just want to close, because again, 1 minute to the hour, with just a gigantic thank you. Thank you again to Christian Klesse. Thank you to Michael Gamble-McCormick of Senator Casey's office, who unfortunately did have to hop off. We can't monopolize Senator Casey's disability expert, sadly, as much as we would like. But thank you so much to Senator Casey's team on the Senate Special Committee for Aging for joining us. And then, of course, thank you, Cheryl and Cyrus from National Disability Rights Network, some of the fiercest advocates for those with disabilities and certainly the experts on this issue. Thank you again for volunteering your time to talk with the community today. Please, again, everybody go to mdausa.org/advocacy, mda.org/advocacy to join us in supporting this legislation. And everybody, please have a great rest of your National Disability Independence Day. Thank you all.